So the first speaker of the morning is going to be Joshua Benton, who is the director of the Nieman Journalism Lab, with over a decade of experience in domestic and international journalism. Most recently, he was reporting at the Dallas Morning News, and there he reported on cheating on standardized tests in the Texas public schools. He's been up for several awards, investigative awards for international journalism, and has reported from 10 foreign countries, been a Pew Fellow in International Journalism, and was even a rock critic for the Toledo Blade. Welcome, Joshua Benton.
Good morning, everybody. Taking me a second to set up, get everything going here. How's everyone doing this morning? Did you enjoy your evening in Cambridge last night? Different from your college towns? Similar to your college towns? Take a second. While you're getting set up, I want to ask you all about your news habits. So it needs to be at this mic for the recording, I guess I do. So how many of you, raise your hand, have read a print newspaper this morning? All right, you realize you guys are weird, right? You're really, really weird to be 21-year-olds or so reading a newspaper. How many of you have been on Facebook this morning? See, they keep saying that you guys are getting off of Facebook, and it just doesn't seem to be accurate. I don't know. All right, you're doing great. How about on Twitter? How many of you on Twitter so far this morning? Good. And Snapchat. You guys are kind of shy hand raisers, I'm noticing. Sort of like up to here, maybe. We're good? The spinning beach ball of death. Yeah. You take it as every presenter everywhere. Let me tell you a little bit about oh, good, a crash. That's great. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and Nieman Lab and what we do while we're doing that. So I started off in newspapers. I wish there was a Georgia's conference when I was a college student at Yale University. I was editor of the college paper and I'd been editor of my high school newspaper. I was really into journalism. I got into journalism when I was in high school because David Duke, does anyone remember who David Duke is? Yeah, he's been back in the news recently. He is the former Klansman, a neo-Nazi, who was running for office in the state of Louisiana, my home state, a state that doesn't always make the wisest political decisions. David Duke was running for office, was getting 60% of the white vote in my home state. I thought that was terrible, so I helped start my high school newspaper in part to have on the front page a fresh editorial every issue about how terrible it was that we were thinking about electing a neo-Nazi to state office. Turns out, thankfully enough, people agreed with me. That is not the right presentation, but see that one there? Right there. There we go. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Then I went to newspapers. My first job was in Toledo, as I was a rock critic as well as an investigative reporter and State House correspondent, and then moved on to the Dallas Morning News, and then eventually came here. I run something called Nieman Lab, which is part of the Nieman Foundation here at Harvard. We're essentially a combination newsroom and research unit that tries to figure out the future of news. Our job is to try and understand where digital technology is taking the news business, the creation of journalism, the act of reporting, the production and distribution. So I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions, and you can think about those questions being as broad as possible about the news business and where it's all going, because I know there are a lot of things that you guys are going to be interested in. So I'm just today going to do very simply 10 things that I think you guys should know about the media world today. And feel free to interrupt me with questions along the way. So we'll start off with a few items about the business. You guys are all in the journalism business in one sense. You work for a publication, an outlet, a news organization, but journalists have traditionally not always known a lot about how the business is doing. So just a couple of trends there that I want to highlight. One is maybe obvious to you, but it's taking some time for the industry to understand. Smartphones are a far bigger deal than the news industry understands them to be. So can anyone identify what these two pictures are? In 2005, we got a new Pope, Pope Benedict. This was the scene at St. Peter's Square. We got Pope Francis in 2013, the exact same scene. Do you notice anything different about these two photographs? Anything at all? That's, it's odd to think that just, 11 years ago, our information gathering means were so different. Most American news outlets now get the majority of their digital traffic on smartphones. In other words, when you think of all the time that people spend building these beautiful websites and they're picturing them on their big iMacs and they're looking at them or on their laptops, that's not the view that people are seeing. They're actually seeing a mobile device on a phone. If you're thinking about building an interactive, building a graphic, if it doesn't work on your phone, it just doesn't work. So what does the shift from desktop computers and laptop computers to smartphones mean? Well, fundamentally, it means a shift away from the web and towards apps, right? You think about your own use of your phone. Smartphone users on average spend about 6 minutes inside apps for every 1 minute they spend inside Safari or Chrome or whatever their web browser is, right? So what was the glorious thing about the web? It was that every news site or every site on the internet was just another URL. nytimes.com can sit right next to my favorite hobby blog.blogspot.com, and they're all sort of equal citizens, right? When you shift to apps, though, that changes quite a bit. And the result of that is this sort of second big trend, which is that the platforms are winning and publishers don't know how to deal. What do you think I'm talking about when I say the platforms? What are some examples that come to mind? What is a platform in this context?
Social media.
Social media, okay, but more specifically, like Facebook is a platform, right? Apple is a platform because they control an app store that you can put apps into or not. Snapchat is a platform. Twitter is a platform. I mean, think about your own news reading experience. How much of it happens inside some other app, inside Facebook or inside Twitter or inside something else? So let me give you a little bit of history on this. Before the web came along, this is roughly how a typical American newspaper spent its money. So on the left side, you'll see a variety of categories. Focus on the 3 pie slices that are on the right. Those are all about distribution, production, and raw materials. In other words, buying dead trees, buying gallons of ink, putting gas in the trucks that are going to be delivering the newspaper to somewhere else, and running the printing presses. Half of the entire cost of running a newspaper was in production and distribution. Notice the small slice, 14%, the red one, that's editorial, that's the newsroom. That's all the reporters and all the editors. That number is now probably about 12% for most American newspapers, maybe lower in some cases. So when you think about a newspaper, you may think about the people who do all the writing and the reporting and stuff, but actually in the old model, the real business was an industrial business, actually delivering the content. There were some optimists, some mistaken optimists it turned out, who worked at newspapers and looked at this and said, oh, okay, well the web's going to come along and it's going to solve the right half of that pie for us. We're no longer going to have to pay for trucks. We're not going to have to pay for printing presses and ink and paper. So maybe we'll lose half of our costs and keep all of our revenue and things are going to be great. We're just going to be incredibly profitable and newspapers are going to go boldly into the 21st century. No, that is not what happened, because this is what happened. This is a scary roller coaster of a chart. This is American print newspaper advertising revenue, adjusted for inflation from 1950 to about 2013. I can tell you that this chart has continued to go down and is now probably about 14 billion. That should be a B, not a T. So can anyone come up with any theories as to why somewhere around 2006 or so, the American print newspaper business just went from around $60 billion a year in revenue to, say, $15 billion a year in the span of less than a decade? Yeah?
People are getting their news from more than just traditional newspapers and big media corporations now.
Okay, so people have a variety of new options, right? That's one thing, yeah.
The Great Recession happened and companies were going under and didn't want to pay for print advertising, which is expensive.
That is true. Historically speaking, newspapers reacted more strongly to economic boom times and economic recessions because advertisers would throw in more money when the times are good and take out more when the times are bad. What else?
People stopped putting classifieds in papers because of like Craigslist and things like that.
So there came along free alternatives for classified advertising that were in a lot of ways better than what was you paid for before. Any others?
Newspapers are still learning how to sell advertising online, and are still learning how to do so.
Right. I mean, this is almost the scariest part of the line. The red line includes online advertising. You can see there's not a lot of difference. Newspapers, there's a ton of online advertising, but newspapers have not gained from it. Yeah.
Going back to what you were saying earlier, the invention, or I should say the introduction of the iPhone to the market in 2006.
Yeah, so that would be a part of it, yeah. Wouldn't have had the big impact here until the iPhone got bigger, but yeah, you're absolutely right, it's a big impact right now. There's one other one I'll just mention, which is that newspapers had essentially a quasi-monopoly on pricing before the web. I mean, if you lived in Dallas, Texas, where I used to live, and you wanted to advertise in a newspaper or in any medium that in print reached a large number of people, you had one choice. You had the Dallas Morning News. That was the only paper in town. And that meant that that paper had the ability to set the price pretty much wherever they wanted to. Digital comes along and anyone can have a website and anyone can sell now on that website. That means that monopoly power that they had all disappeared. And that's why you get that enormous decline. There were a lot of people in the newspaper business who even, like say around here, thought, this is just a little dip. We'll come right back. They were not always the best strategists. The owner of one major newspaper chain in 2012, when he decided to sell his newspapers to Warren Buffett, said, you know what, we just realized a few months ago that this is a real change, that this isn't just a recession and we're going to come back from it at some point. So why would digital platforms have an advantage over print platforms when it comes to selling ads? Well, one big reason is that newspapers see their audience as a really undifferentiated mass of people. So if you're the Boston Globe, for example, and you're selling newspapers, what do you know about your readers? You know that they live roughly in the Boston area, right? Maybe you have a specific address if you have a home delivery, but that gives you maybe a neighborhood. But they don't know, does your house really only read the sports section and toss everything up right away? Do you have a house that has kids that really love comics and that's what they really want? Or is it that your household is really interested in business coverage? Yeah, obviously you're sending out one product to everybody. You can't customize it. So newspapers had very little good data about their users, their readers. So who has good data about their users? This guy. I don't know if Mark Zuckerberg ever was in this building, but he was around in this neighborhood. I don't know if he ever came to an event here or not. But think about what two companies, Facebook and Google, know about you. So Facebook knows who you know, where you've lived, what content you like, every time you hit the like button anywhere. What you buy, where you shop, they buy data about their users from real life retail locations to try and track that information. They know what websites you visit. You know, every time you see a like button, even if you don't click on it, that means that Facebook is able to connect your visit to that web page to your profile. Google has a slightly different but still incredibly strong set of data about you. They know what you're searching for, your deepest, darkest secrets that you type into that search bar. If you use Gmail, they know who you email, what you email, what apps are on your Android phone, and sometimes what apps are on your iPhone. Locations that you search for on Google Maps, what you chat about in GChat, the videos you watch on YouTube. This is an enormous amount of data, and they know that across devices, across years. Google and Facebook know a lot about you. That means that they're able to sell knowledge about you to advertisers far more efficiently than the Boston Globe can. Take an obvious example. This quote is from a 2008 New York Times story that, even though it's now almost a decade old, the issue behind it keeps coming up. It was about a woman who was doing focus groups, talking to college students about how they get their news. And one of the young women that she was speaking to, one of the college students, said, "If the news is that important, it will find me." Does that resonate with anybody? Anyone who seems to that? Yeah. If the news is that important, it will find me. Now think about how different that was in the old system before the web. You read a newspaper, it was delivered to your home every morning, and you set aside time at the breakfast table, on the train, wherever it may be, to read that newspaper. When you got home, you probably watched an evening television newscast that was at a set time that you set aside to go get news in your life. Compare that to how you get news now, which is maybe some of it, those behaviors still exist, but a large portion of it is news sort of fitting its way into the blank spaces of your day. When you have a few minutes to mess around on your phone, when you get a push notification, when someone, you see something on Twitter that someone is sharing a link. It's a very different modality, and it gives all the power to those platforms. And the end result is this. This is 2004 data for the entire world other than China, so China's not included in here. But of all the ads on all the mobile devices around the entire world, other than China, half of the money went to Google. Another 22% of the money went to Facebook. So that's 70% that just goes to 2 companies. Since that time, the Facebook share has grown somewhat substantially. Everybody else, every publisher, every newspaper, every TV operation that has a website, everybody else is stuck in the others. And sad little Twitter, 3% of the world is pretty darn good, but still kind of sad compared to Google and Facebook. So what's been the impact of this? The distributed content revolution was a way that a lot of people framed what happened last year in 2015. Does anyone recognize what these things are on the screen? Who can say what they are? Facebook Instant Articles. Raise your hand if you've come across a Facebook Instant Articles at some point. Someone tell me whether you found it to be a superior experience to clicking a link and going to a mobile website. Yeah. So for those who may not know, Facebook Instant Articles is basically Facebook going to publishers and saying, look, we know that your users aren't going to you anymore. We know that you're relying on us for half of your traffic. But you have a really bad website. You know what we're good at Facebook? Running websites. We're really good at it. How about instead of just publishing your news story on the open web, you also publish it inside Facebook? On one hand, you can see why that's appealing to publishers, because Facebook does know how to run websites really, really well. And that is a huge driver of audience. And if they can get a little bit more traffic from Facebook, that's a really important thing for them. On the other hand, you can also see why it's kind of sad that you're giving up more of your power. That distribution half of the pie chart, you're just handing more of it over to this company. And this very small set of companies, 6 or 7 companies that are all within about 30 miles of each other in Northern California and Silicon Valley, they control an enormous part of the distribution of news and information. We also saw last year Apple News come along, which is Apple essentially saying the same thing. I'm curious, do any of you use Apple News? Yeah, I think so. It's not that great of a product. But it's, again, Apple saying, hey, we have this enormous platform called the iPhone. You should be publishing news directly within our custom platform. I bet some of you have used Snapchat Discover at some point, right? You are America's youth after all. It is designed for you. Snapchat Discover, very similar, saying to publishers, you should be creating content specially designed to fit in the vertical format of a Snapchat screen. And it's been pretty successful in terms of reaching really big audiences. So this broad trend is that we're going from print dollars, this is the metaphor you hear a lot, we're going from print dollars, when newspapers in print controlled the distribution and had local pricing monopolies, to digital dimes. You lose 90% of your revenue, let's say, when you go to digital, because you give up those powers. And then mobile pennies. This is the sad state of the traditional newspaper and old media world. So how have they responded? One way they've responded is with something called native advertising. Can anyone define for me what native advertising is? Native, yeah?
It's an advertising that looks like content that would appear on the publication that you're reading.
Exactly. So this is David Ogilvy, who was one of the great men of advertising, like he was of the Mad Men era, 1962. And so the quote, there's no need for advertisements to look like advertisements. If you make them look like editorial pages, you'll attract about 50% more readers. You might think the public would resent this trick, but there's no evidence to suggest that they do. Now, that's a very cynical ad man way of approaching things. But in the last 2 years, essentially every premium publisher in the United States and the UK has adopted native advertising as a key part of their growth model. So this is the New York Times. You can imagine someone coming across this on nytimes.com and thinking, oh look, here's a New York Times story about how our energy needs are changing. A series of interactive charts. That seems like a thing the New York Times might do. But this is actually produced, as you can see from this small logo, by Chevron. Chevron, you might imagine, has its own set of interests at play when it comes to how our energy needs are changing. So the New York Times, this is what their premium, their native ads look like. They're labeled paid post, small. They have a little logo here. It says T-Brand Studio. If you ever see T-Brand Studio, that's their code for this is not produced by the newsroom. And they use a different typeface. It's not the New York Times headline typeface. But nonetheless, you can imagine some people, in this world, that's a relatively good differentiation from regular news content, but still pretty confusing. This is what the Atlantics look like. Slightly different colored background, but in some ways closer than what the New York Times does. Forbes is just shameless. So unless you've noted, this is Citibank wrote this piece, or based on the Citibank itself, the bank in the building, not right piece. You see Forbes brand voice, which is vaguely Orwellian as a term. But otherwise, the typefaces, the layout is exactly what a regular Forbes store looks like. Then you have our friend BuzzFeed. Now, I know that you all are really into gardening hacks. I know that's a thing that the kids today are really into. But if you came across this BuzzFeed article, Garden on Fleet, does that date this article? This is last May. This, as you can tell, looks just like a BuzzFeed article because BuzzFeed, essentially, their ads look exactly like their articles. Unless you understand that Miracle-Gro brand publisher means something, you're probably not going to notice. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on what you think about these publishers, some of them very well known, some of them long established, a century old, with strong brands and strong identities and reputations. What do you think about this? Who thinks it's great or thinks it's terrible? Or something more nuanced, those two choices? Yeah.
I feel like it's a more effective way of, with the New York Times obviously has this sponsored content, but compared to the Washington Post, where a lot of their content has gone sort of clickbaity, especially their headlines, ever since Jeff Bezos took over. I have a whole conspiracy theory, but so I feel like
we can talk more about that later. Yeah.
Okay. I feel like that direction, where they're just moving towards posts that are going to get a lot of clicks, is a worse direction than fragmenting their content into sponsored content and actual high quality content.
Okay.
It's like a move towards the middle. I just think.
Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think to some degree, though, it compromises the quality of the news that is being published because, yes, it says paid post, yes, it says Chevron, but at the same time, a reader could absolutely click on it, miss those things, and then read this article and be like, oh, this is weird, why is the New York Times writing this piece? And it kind of undermines their credibility for other pieces, maybe that they write about energy. That's a whole other conversation about, how do your advertisers represent the content you have, but here you're almost endorsing the content that they're providing because you're giving it such a huge platform to sit on in the medium.
Right, yeah.
I think piggybacking off of what he's saying, I think it's a smart decision that publishers are doing this, but I think it opens up a whole new can of worms. There needs to be a greater level of news literacy in the American public, so I think that's it's smart for their business, but it's bad for their journalism. But I think that there's a whole other aspect that needs to be pursued by media companies.
And I imagine you've all at some point clicked on something on Facebook or some other platform that you think is a real story, and you go click on it, and it's not really a real story. I had your hand up.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it feels kind of slimy. It feels like, while again, it seems like it would be effective, but in a kind of backhanded way, and as much as they're compromising ethically in order to make these posts work, which I sort of feel like there's almost a little bit of well, everything else is getting compromised now in the digital age, so I don't know, just stinks of desperation a little bit. It's well, everyone else is doing kind of slimy things too, so it doesn't matter as much. It's okay, you're the New York Times, people are trying to rely on you for whatever balanced media might be to them, and so it seems, I don't know, it just seems pretty
Yeah. You may have seen that Mashable this week laid off a whole bunch of people, and in the memo that the founder posted about it, he said, we need to stop having this rigid separation between our news content and our branded content, and the brands want to tell stories with us. What a beautiful like putting a baby to sleep sort of way to frame. The brands want to tell stories with us. Like, let's just gather around a campfire. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about like what is going to be the next step like after this. Like
Right.
what is, you know, if we continue going down this road of branded content.
Yeah. I mean, this is a natural reaction to what I've been talking about the platforms, right? Because Facebook is always going to win on data, right? What does the New York Times have? The New York Times has a terrific brand that's been around for a very long time. And their bet is that they can, you know, let some company, Chevron or whoever else, take a little bit of the shine of that brand and let it reflect on them. It's making a lot of money for a lot of people, but journalists generally don't like it for very understandable reasons. So these exact ones that I just showed you from the Times and Atlantic and Forbes and BuzzFeed were part of a study done last year in which a number of people were shown those articles. And the result was that basically people were not able to make the distinction. Like if you just show people and then ask them, what was that? They say, oh, that was an article, right? On nearly every publication we tested, consumers tend to identify native advertising as an article, not as an advertisement. So what comes next? I mean, when you think about what does come next, some of the ideas that people are thinking about would be, so what happens when we go to virtual reality and augmented reality? Like, are people going to stand for ads showing up in their Oculus Rift? Is that going to be a model that is going to make sense for people? I don't know, maybe not. Does anyone know what the Amazon Echo is? Does anyone have an Amazon Echo? Describe what an Amazon Echo is.
Voice controlled.
It's this
assistant.
Yeah, it's this tower thing that you shout out and it does things to you, but it's a completely voice automated service. And it's very hard to think how ads fit into that at all, right? And then on top of that, all of you people have ad blockers on. All of you, I know you do. In America, around 15% of Americans or so are using ad blockers. This is an area where other countries are farther down the line. In Germany, about 35% of all internet users have ad blockers on. And of course, as you probably know, as of last fall, you can have an ad blocker on your iPhone. If you didn't know that, pretend I didn't tell you that, so we don't need you installing more ad blockers. But you're getting to some really fundamental questions about what is the role that advertising is going to play in paying for media. And these are really open questions in a lot of ways. A third point I'll make, Ellen, what time does this session end, just so I know?
10:30.
10:30, okay. What's happening to newspapers is in the early stages of happening in broadcast. Now, I'm just curious, do any of you work or have aspirations to work in TV or radio as opposed to print? Yeah? As a newspaper guy, I've always felt kind of mad that my industry got disrupted by the internet more rapidly than my colleagues in broadcast did. But we're starting to see the early signs of the same sort of thing happening. And if you have an Apple TV or a Roku or the Amazon Fire TV stick or Chromecast, any other device that sort of puts an internet television on your television, or of course all of you have laptops and you, I'm sure, are busy watching, on your stolen HBO Now password, getting access to Game of Thrones and the rest. There is this idea that television, which was essentially based around broadcast towers, and broadcast towers that are locally based in Boston or in Hartford or in Albany or wherever, we're shifting to this over-the-top model. And it's really unclear what happens in that sort of environment. What is the place for local news in that? Why is there, what the most common way that Americans get news is local television news. That's not necessarily the happiest thing in the world because most local television news is pretty terrible. But it is nonetheless the single most popular route, more popular than the internet and more popular than newspapers, right? So whether it's good news or bad news, what is the role for local news broadcasts and local news operations in a world where you're getting your television through Netflix and through Amazon Prime and through HBO Now and by going to CBS.com if you want to go see something there? You essentially have this localized system of distribution that is again being preempted by the internet. Sound familiar? And how does local news fit in that space? We don't really know. And there are a lot of channels that benefit from being part of a larger bundle that gets sold to someone who has a cable subscription. But if people have the chance to choose what channels they want, the term for the people are throwing around is skinny bundles. The idea that instead of having 100 channels, you will be able to pick the 8 channels that you actually want to watch. When that happens, what happens to the other channels that have been surviving based on that subsidy? We have the same sort of thing happening in radio with the shift to podcasting. We have all these companies that are all investing big into building, they all want to be the HBO of podcasting. They want to build really high quality networks of shows. They're really coming for terrestrial radio and for public radio in particular. You can imagine, I don't know how many of you listened to radio this morning? I didn't ask that question at the beginning. Yeah. Probably because you were not all in cars this morning, maybe, or you're not in cars that you had control of the radio of at least, right? Because so much of radio consumption is in cars, there are real questions about when internet connections in cars get better and easier. I mean, you can certainly listen to podcasts over your speakers now, but it's still a little bit complicated. Like when that gets easier, you can imagine really significant shifts there. And think 5 years out when we're all driving self-driving cars. Well, we won't be driving self-driving cars when we're all riding in self-driving cars. When you don't have to live on the road in the same way, then suddenly video and text become competitors. There are a lot of questions about where radio is going to go, and I think we're going to see some really big shifts there. Number 4, you will never have a more captive audience than today. I've spoken at this conference since 2009, I believe, 2008 actually. And college newspapers are a very unique part of the journalism ecosystem. You have a relatively captive audience. Your newspapers are generally free, they're distributed for free. They are distributed often in dining halls or places where people are gathering. That is a more direct and easy connection to audience than what every publication or outlet you work for afterwards. And the corollary to this is that college newspapers are some of the most conservative places in journalism. And I don't mean political conservative. I mean that because all of you work at your newspaper for only a short period of time, you're there for 4 years, you're maybe working on the paper for 2 or 3 of those, you're maybe having some sense of running it for a year. That means that you don't have that much time to really invest in new things and try new things and then focus on change. And that's why a lot of newspapers, college newspapers are the places where there's the biggest gap between how the people working on it are consuming media and how they're creating media, right? The systems that you have for creating a daily paper that go out or a weekly paper or whatever it may be don't really line up very well with how you're actually getting news. Maybe, again, there might be some exceptions in this crowd, but I just always try to remind people that there's a reason to push past that and to really think, are we producing news and information in the ways that I am consuming news and information? All right, enough nonsense about the business. Let's talk about your careers. Talk about nonsense of your careers now. So just show of hands, this is not a commitment, I'm not your guidance counselor or anything like that. How many of you are thinking about going into the news business or the publishing business in whatever format after you graduate? All right, welcome to the game. So I'll just have 5 quick points about that, and we should still have some time for questions. The first one, your social media presence is an ongoing audition for work, but I mean that in a good way. I don't mean that in the way like, oh, there's that picture of you with a Solo cup on Facebook, you got to get rid of that. Some person's going to check for it and not hire you. I mean that social media is one of the best ways for you to indicate to potential audiences or potential hirers that you're an interesting, compelling person, that you know something, that you're interested in a particular subject matter, that you're good at filtering through information. When I'm looking to hire people, and I've read thousands and thousands of journalist resumes over the last few years, if there's someone who looks interesting, I immediately go see if they have a Twitter feed. If they don't have a Twitter feed, I'm probably not going to hire them, I'm just going to be honest. If they have a boring Twitter feed, then that's pretty problematic. That's a little bit different. I'm not hiring people to write about the future of digital news, so it's a little bit different. But nonetheless, be thinking about the way you're presenting yourself outside of the things that you have that have bylines. Number 7 is that there's very little demand for the standard length college newspaper story in the real world. I'm exaggerating this a bit. There's still some demand for it, but there's not nearly as much as you would expect coming out of seeing what college newspapers produce. Has anyone ever heard of the Quartz Curve? The Quartz Curve was spun off of something we did here, but started by Georgia's conference alum Zach Seward, who used to work for me, worked for the Harvard Crimson, and now is the executive editor of Quartz. Quartz, the business site, qz.com, very good to check out. And their idea is that there's room on the web for short material, and there's room on the web for long material. There's not a lot of room for stuff that's in the middle, right? Stuff that is short and quick and easy to consume, that can have a nice burst of usefulness. There's always going to be an audience for that. And high quality, long form considered work, we got an audience for that. The stuff that's in the middle, however, is what most newspapers produce on a day-to-day basis. Stuff that is not particularly timely, but not particularly profound, right? Zach used to run a desk at Quartz called the Things Desk, which is one of the weirdest names for a part of a news organization. But this is how they define things. A thing can be a surprising factoid or statistic, a chart that shows a trend, a photo you have to look at, a long authoritative feature, exclusive sort of news. A lot of times they're in charts, they can be smart, whatever the format is, but things are always just one thing. They are not a roundup of a lot of different things sort of mashed together into a 14-inch story. So when you're thinking about the kinds of work that you're going to do, there's a very good chance that your first job out of college is going to involve some of these things that don't quite fit into the slot of the newspaper stories that you're probably spending a lot of your time producing. Now that can be on the shorter end, that can be work on social platforms, that can be the things of the sort that we did, charts, data, quick data work. Aggregation and curation will probably be a significant part of your first job. And it can be on the longer end, the production of podcasts, the productions of email newsletters, smart email newsletters, not just things that are sort of machine created, or really considered long form that really takes advantage of the digital medium. A few weeks ago, I tweeted this. Of course, you should all follow me on Twitter. If I were a 22-year-old trying to break into journalism today, it's number 1, smart curated email newsletter, 2, Twitter, 3, freelance, 4, Medium posts. And my one mistake there is I probably should have inserted podcasting somewhere between 3 and 4. There's something about when you're young, you're going to be competing against a whole lot of other people. And you need to have a reason to stand out when your cover letter and resume arrive at someone's desk. And you need to have essentially a persona online that shows that you are a compelling, interesting person who knows how to go deep on something. So if you're interested in doing this, think about something that you're passionate about that no one else is covering. It could be something very small. It really doesn't matter what it is. But if you become known as the person who knows most about that, that is a key to unlock that door. I'll give you one example. This is my friend Nick Kwa. Nick is 26, so he's a few years out of college. Nick worked a number of jobs. He worked at BuzzFeed, he worked at Business Insider for a while, but he was very low-level jobs. He wasn't doing anything particularly spectacular, but he was fascinated by podcasts. He just loved podcasts. He found himself always listening to podcasts. And he saw that there was no one who was really paying attention to the podcast business. There was no one media outlet that was the place that was paying attention to podcasting. So he decided he was going to start it. So he started an email newsletter called Hot Pod. I can question the name, but whatever. That he started last year. That's once a week. It's a roundup of all the important, interesting work, news of the podcast industry with analysis. He does his own original reporting. He does Q&As with people. And it immediately became the Bible of the podcast industry. Everyone in the podcast industry and a lot of people in the public radio industry makes newsletter. To the point that now I pay him every week to syndicate it on Nieman Lab on our site. And he has started a business where he is every week creating a separate second edition of the newsletter that only goes to paying subscribers. You have to pay $7 a month to get it, but it goes deeper and is a little bit nerdier and is really high quality work. So Nick has basically done this model. He was something that he was fascinated with. He saw that there was not someone else in the marketplace paying attention to it. He proved that he could do it, starting with an email newsletter. How boring is that? And now he's built a business out of it that is showing a lot of growth. Now that model is not going to be for everybody. Not everyone's going to want to start their own thing, but it's a model that's out there and can be really great. And the corollary to that is what I've mentioned before. You will go farther if you create like you consume. One thing that I was true when I was in college newspapers, which was 1,000 years ago, is that so much of the way that you do things is handed down to you, right? You do things the way that your predecessor did things, and that predecessor did things the way that his or her predecessor did things, right? So the workflows, the way the publication schedules, the way that your sections are developed, the kinds of things that get on page one, the timing that you post them, all of that is really locked into this system that has been around for a very long time. And just be very cognizant of that. Know that these rules are not handed down on stone tablets. They are not eternal. They are things that were probably created. If you go back to find their source, they're in a very different age with a very different media ecosystem. And you need to be bold about making sure that there's an alignment between your creation and your consumption. And the other corollary to that is you'll probably need to do your most ambitious work on your own, right? So you get your first job out of college, whether it's at a newspaper, a digital startup, a TV outlet, whatever it is, you're probably not going to be given the most interesting assignments. You're probably not going to be immediately given some sort of star project that's going to make your name. You need to take advantage of the fact that you can publish whatever you want to the web anytime you want, to start doing things on the side, on your own, and not worrying about money. That was very easy for someone with a job to say. But you need to, when you apply for a job, you're going to send along, say, 3 clips, 3 things that you've done. If the 3 things you've done are the 3 best small piddly things that you do at your day job, that's a lot harder than if you can send along one of those, the best one of those, but 2 things that are great that you did on your own. That's going to be something that really plays to your advantage. Number 8, if you have any interest in programming at all, learn to code. I'm not going to tell you that everyone needs to learn how to code, and everyone needs to learn Python backwards and forwards, learn how to do data visualization. All that stuff is really great, but I understand that a lot of people who are getting into the journalism business don't want to do that, and they don't have an interest in that, and that's okay. You will suffer in your career for it, but that's fine. That's your own choice. But if you do have even an inkling of interest, you should pursue it, because there is no better way to guarantee your employment for the next decade than to be someone who has journalism skills, but also has data or programming or coding skills. This is a piece that we ran on Nieman Lab this past week by Scott Klein, who created the news apps desk at ProPublica, the nonprofit news outlet. And he was describing how to start a news apps team, people who build these interactive graphics and these database-driven stories and things like that. And this is what he said, there are a bunch of skills needed in building news apps, but at the most abstract level, they fall into these 3 buckets: code, design, and journalism. He says recruit people who have at least 2 of those 3 and are willing to be willing to teach them the 3rd. The easiest by far to teach is code, right? So you guys are going to have journalism skills. If you can have code skills, if you can have design skills, if you can have, and there are other things that you could add in there, that if you have business skills, if you have social media skills, if you have audio skills, there are other things you could add in there. But having that sort of package is really powerful, and the most powerful piece you can have right now, and I think for the foreseeable future, is coding skills. And it's not that hard. Take some dedicated time, go learn some stuff on the web. It's working well. And that's particularly true because an ever-increasing portion of the journalism that you see and that gets produced these days is going to be produced by robots. Maybe not this particular robot. But robots and algorithms are a really increasing share of what gets produced. So, has anyone ever heard of QuakeBot? The Los Angeles Times has a bot called QuakeBot that every second or every minute reads the United States Geological Service website, where they publish automated data on earthquakes. So when there's an earthquake, a new posting goes up. This QuakeBot goes, fetches that, sees whenever there is an earthquake above a certain level or within a certain number of miles from Los Angeles, and pulls it in and automatically writes a story that automatically gets published at LAtimes.com. Wow. And then humans will come in and add on to it, right? Well, there have been some cases where QuakeBot gets the byline and the human gets the contributing line at the bottom, which is always kind of amusing. Baseball stories. The Associated Press produces thousands and thousands of college baseball stories every year in which no human beings are involved in their production. Now, why baseball? Because baseball has box scores. Box scores tell you everything that happened in the game in a very regimented, structured way. So it's not that hard to build an algorithm and figure out, oh, well, this home run in the 6th inning with 3 men on was actually the key moment in the game. And the AP is already producing lots and lots of stories of this. Financial reports. When quarterly earnings are produced at the SEC, they are in a standardized format. So now Reuters will pull in that data and automatically generate earnings stories based on that with no humans involved. So on one, you can take 2 lessons from this. One is you need to be really good to be able to produce stuff that is better than the robots. The robots, generally speaking, don't have a real sense of style. They're not very great writers, but they're very robotic in a certain sense. The other thing you can say is you want to be creating those robots, right? That's a great place to be. Number 9, the good jobs are more centered in New York than ever before. This makes me sad. So my first job was at the Toledo Blade in lovely Toledo, Ohio. As I said, I'm from a small town in South Louisiana. I worked in Dallas, which is not a small town, but is nonetheless not near a coast. Gulf Coast, I guess, 4 hours or so. But the industry is moving to places like this. This is Vice's lovely new headquarters in Brooklyn, right? It's very nice. Probably have good lattes there or whatever. So a few weeks ago, I just did some number crunching to look at where job postings are. Journalismjobs.com, just one job site. And 8% of all the newspaper jobs were either in New York or DC, 10% of all the TV jobs were in New York and DC, and 38% of the digital jobs were in New York and DC. And that trend is increasing. We're seeing this massive concentration, mostly in New York, secondarily in DC, and then you can throw in San Francisco and LA, but a very small number of cities. As opposed to the old model, remember distribution trucks, every city had a major newspaper and a major newsroom. There are a whole lot of reasons why this is very disappointing for democracy, right? I mean, we still structure our politics around cities and counties and states and school districts and things like that. We kind of lucked out for the 20th century that there was an alignment between those interests. There isn't anymore. But setting aside the democracy piece of it, you want to be working at a place, if it's at all possible, a place with money and ambition. I had a friend of mine who was thinking about taking a job at BuzzFeed. And you can like BuzzFeed, you can dislike BuzzFeed, but there's no question that BuzzFeed has money and ambition, right? The saddest thing about the newspaper business, at least 99% of the American newspaper business, is that they have been doing nothing but managing their decline for the last decade. The Raleigh News and Observer, a paper in North Carolina, their publisher retired yesterday. And the story that announced his retirement said that he had been a publisher for 16 years. When he took over 16 years ago, the News and Observer had 1,200 employees. Now it has 350. That's 16 years. If you're debating different kinds of choices, even though it pains me to say, don't do what I did. Don't go to Toledo for your first job if you can all avoid it. If you have a chance to be in a place with money and ambition, take it, even if the job doesn't seem quite as immediately appealing to you, because you sort of need a way into that world. And the last point, before we have a few minutes left for questions, publishers really need people with journalism instincts in the tech side and in the business side. You used to be able to make a good living in the world as a poet. Being a poet used to be a job, used to be a business. Like you could make a good living. I'm talking 500 years ago. Okay, in case that wasn't clear. This wasn't like when I was a kid. No. But actually, publishing technology meant that it was a lot easier to publish small chapbooks than it was to publish big thick books. So that meant that poets who were pumping out verse could make a really nice living. It was an established career, right? Technology comes along, changes that industry pretty substantially. What happens? Poetry ends up becoming not career training, right? It becomes like a liberal art, right? There's a sense in which journalism skills is moving in a similar direction. It sounds very nihilistic, but what I mean is journalism, if you're good at journalism, what are you good at? You're good at writing, you're good at asking questions, you're good at analyzing documents, you're good at detecting the narrative thread through a distinct set of events and facts. These are all things that are incredibly valuable skills. And there are a lot of companies, both within the news industry and outside the news industry, for whom that set of skills is still very valuable. Even if it doesn't mean that you're going to be writing stories. Think about ways that you can highlight what skills you have in that world. If you don't want to go into journalism, or if it doesn't work out, those skills will still work well in a lot of places. So to wrap up, old models are declining, but new models are being born. They're being born with some difficulty. It was very frustrating to see Mashable's layoffs because we're starting to see, I think, a top for the BuzzFeeds and the Business Insiders and the Mashables, and unclear what's going to come after them. Vice, saw a big decline in audience last quarter. But nonetheless, there's a lot of new stuff happening. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening right now. There is a real thirst in news organizations for people who both get journalism and who get the 2016 internet, right? When I was first going into, I got to college in 1993 and was building web pages very shortly thereafter, right when the web was very young. So when I graduated college in 97, my web skills were very rare, right? They're not nearly as rare anymore. But I can tell you, there are a whole lot of people who work in news organizations who don't know what the hell to make of Snapchat. They have no idea, right? People who have skills for the 2016 version of the internet, which means chat apps and the social platforms and all these other things, there's a real demand for them. So I think it is a really exciting time to be in journalism. I think there are going to be a lot of great opportunities for all of you. But just be aware and be cognizant of what's happening in the business, because that's going to have a big impact on your career. So we have 8 minutes left. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have about any of that or anything else about the news business in general, since that's what I do. Yes?
I think one thing that's kind of interesting is this kind of like rise of these like video blurbs, I guess. Like, I guess on like Facebook, you'll
Right.
see videos produced by like Now This or BuzzFeed that are kind of like provide little tidbits of information.
Right.
What do you make of those, and like how do you see that kind of like progressing in the future when it comes to journalism?
So in my inevitable move towards my own obsolescence, video is going to be a big part of that, right? So there's a theory that everything is going to be video, that text is going to virtually disappear, and that basically television will be subsumed into the internet, and that video will be everything. So part of that is Facebook Live video, Periscope, that sort of thing. I'm just curious, how many of you watched The Watermelon yesterday at all? Oh my God, I guess you were busy, you were in transit, that makes sense. Does anyone know what The Watermelon is that I'm referring to? What was The Watermelon?
Well, I just saw the headline and it was like, can you burst this watermelon? And then I didn't click it because it sounds stupid.
So, everyone knows what Facebook Live is, the fact that there are live videos anyone can put on Facebook. Yesterday, BuzzFeed, because they are the geniuses of this, decided that they were going to take a watermelon and wrap it with rubber bands, one after the other, until the watermelon exploded, which is a thing that people do. I don't know. They did this and they put it online. 2.3 million people watched it yesterday. At peak, 802,000 people were watching it at peak. 2 million numbers for anyone who watched at any point. It had a bigger audience than basically anything on daytime television at 3 p.m. yesterday. So video is a big area, and part of it is what you're talking about. Social video is the term that people put for things that are designed. You'll notice they all have text on top of an overlay because they know that people aren't listening with the volume on, right? Now this is the biggest mover in that space. Now this used to have a little bit more of a news ambition that they've sort of scaled back. Now they're just doing sort of grabbing wire images and things and doing it, and they've gotten quite good at it. That combined with Facebook turning on autoplay in the news feed means that they're getting really big numbers. I find it kind of unsatisfying as a news product, but I don't know the degree to which I'm just an old fogey on that point. But it is a big area where a lot of people are investing. The Boston Globe, for example, is just hiring people. Had a couple job openings for people to do social video for Facebook, and secondarily for Twitter, but for Facebook, it's an area of growth. Yeah.
I think more and more we're seeing this trend of in order to garner attention.
What, I'm sorry?
In order to gain attention, right? Publications are throwing these very short blurbs online with a very sensationalist title and often information that's not exactly verified.
Yeah.
But that gains a lot of attention. So what sort of your advice and insight in terms of, is that the direction that newspapers should be going in the future in order to retain that readership?
Well, so newspapers are generally not going in that direction because they have so much old school DNA, right?
Right.
You see efforts to try and tiptoe in a version of that. So for example, the New York Times a few months ago created what they call the Express Desk, Express Team, I guess. And the Express Team is a group of about 8 people whose job it is to sort of notice things happening in social media and turn around stories very quickly on those. Now they're doing that because the sort of main metabolism of New York Times reporters is not to do that, it's to file for the next day's paper, right? So that's a newspapery way to sort of get in that direction. Now, I think most of that, what you're talking about is less about publishers and more about social media and the fact that people will post things on Twitter and they will sort of get amplified. The publisher move is, well, then we'll embed that tweet on a story and we'll put a headline on it and we'll distribute that on social media just so the snake can eat its tail and we'll all, die. But, so I think there's a very real push towards real-time information. I think that doesn't in any way eliminate the need for journalists to be strong evaluators of truth claims and to look at evidence and to understand these things. There are some companies that have sprouted up that are specifically dedicated to doing real-time evaluation of veracity of social media posts. Storyful is probably the most noted one. The real change is that before the web, only a very small number of people had the ability to reach an audience with information. Now virtually anyone can, and that means that standards that a news organization could sort of have on their own and they would be the standards for everybody, those standards don't exist anymore. So just look at the place that you're thinking about maybe going to and thinking, do my standards align with these? Yeah.
I wanted to ask, how's the paid subscription model doing, and if there's a future to it?
Well, so one of the big moves, so if you figure that advertising is dropping off, traditionally American newspapers made 80% of their revenue from advertising, 20% from readers paying. With online, it's pretty much all advertising except for those who put up paywalls, who are asking for subscriptions. So there are two success stories. There is the Wall Street Journal, which has had a paywall for over a decade. And there's the New York Times, which started theirs in 2011 and now has about 1.1 million paying subscribers. It's a really substantial revenue stream for them, and it's working out for them. It's still a relatively small part of their overall revenue, maybe 10 to 15%, but it's better than not having it. Outside of those two papers, paywalls have been, broadly speaking, disappointments. The number one, the most successful non-national newspaper is actually here in Boston, the Boston Globe, which has about 64,000 paying subscribers. But most newspapers that have started paywalls, essentially their audiences have realized the content that you have as a local newspaper is not good enough. It's not differentiated enough. People are saying, I don't see the value in getting it delivered when I can go get news from 1,000 other places. Local news organizations used to benefit from being the packager of all sorts of different kinds of news, right? If you had got a local newspaper, you got local news from it, but you also got the national news, and you also got the global news, and you also got the baseball box scores, and you also got the comics, and you got the gardening column, you got everything else. If you're a newspaper reader today, you can get almost all those things elsewhere. You can go get your sports from ESPN, you can go get your gardening columns from Miracle Grow on BuzzFeed or whatever. Local news is the one place where local outlets still have, an edge, but so many of them have gutted their newsroom so much that their quality is not high. So in general, a lot of outlets started paywalls in 2012, 2013. They had an initial burst of people who subscribed, and their numbers have plateaued or even shrunk in some cases. So it's not proving to be a cure-all that some people want. Yeah.
Just because you mentioned the Miracle Grow example, when I first saw that, the first thing I thought was, like, my grandma uses Miracle Grow. How much do you think of kind of this media brand relationship that's occurring is just sort of repurposing of existing brands, existing tropes in just kind of a new setting, in a flashier, kind of the important news will get to me mentality and machine?
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to get thoughts from other people on that. Like, do you feel like the old brands, or the old news brands, have a big impact? Like, again, you're people who work for college newspapers, you guys are weird, but is the New York Times brand still meaningful to you? Do you want New York Times news as opposed to BuzzFeed News or Business Insider News? Yeah?
I think there's an idea, to some extent, that, older, more established companies, I don't go to BuzzFeed to get, news. BuzzFeed does some, great long-form stuff,
Yeah.
Occasionally, but, I'm not on BuzzFeed because I'm trying to, engage my brain,
Right.
But, when I'm on the New York Times, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to learn something about the world. And I think the way that we approach different websites kind of speaks to what their brand entails.
See, well, the trend line has been for a lot of, there's sort of a model of how to disrupt an industry when there's a technological shift. And one model of doing that is starting at the low end of the business and working your way up. So before your time, Americans used to drive pretty much only American cars, right? But then the Japanese came along in the 1970s, and Toyota and stuff, and they started off with really cheap cars that were cheap and reliable, but didn't make nearly as much money as what the Cadillacs and things, right? But then they move up the chain, and then they start making Toyotas and good family cars, and they start making Lexuses, right? So there's a model of these online startups which is similar. The idea that you start off as BuzzFeed with listicles and cat gifs and sort of low-end cheap content. And then you move up, and then you hire a newsroom, and you hire an investigative team, and then you open foreign bureaus, right? That same sort of model. What I think is frustrating about what Mashable did this week was they essentially were going up that same path. They hired Jim Roberts from the New York Times and were trying to do more serious news. And this week they decided, no, let's get rid of all that. So I think there are a lot of people who are interested in being the digital native brand, news brand that replaces, local newspapers, but also the Times and the Post and whatever else. They're having, I think, mixed success on that point. Yeah. All right, one more or zero? One more question. Yes?
Hi, do you see the proliferation of web and app news content as a democratizing agent, or one that perpetuates inequality based on access to quality content?
Yeah. It's a good question, and one that is a complicated answer that I'll try to do very quickly. So for those of us who were around in the early days of the web, us fogies, there was this idea that the web was going to be democratizing, right? It meant that no longer were just a few news organizations or publishers able to reach audiences. Anyone could start a web page, anyone could distribute their information, right? And when you think about sort of the optimism of the blogosphere around 2002 or so, that's sort of the later version of that vibe. What has happened in case after case is that broad democratization has sort of like an accordion compressed back on itself. So like news distribution has gone from the open platform of the web to being controlled by a very few tech companies and platforms, right? And the sort of broad democratization that happened with the blogging world, I mean, you don't see a lot of blogs these days. You know, people don't invest time in that because it either shifts into professionalization, like the Huffington Post and Slate and, you know, BuzzFeed and whatever else, or it shifts into social media, which is not professionalized, but which is easy and quick and satisfying in a variety of ways, right? I think that, again, what I said before, democracy in this country at least is very based on locality and location, and the internet destroys location. There's no reason for someone to start an online news site of any ambition that's local anymore, because there's no reason that you should want to limit your audience to only people in Austin, Texas, when you could reach everybody, right? So I think there are some very real ways in which the ability to reach an audience without having a broadcast tower or a printing press is very real. I mean, you can look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement, you can look at all the ways in which social media and hashtags have led to social change and information reaching large numbers of people. And that's a real thing. But I think in some ways that's smaller than the impact that we're seeing in this sort of compressing to a very small number of voices that are either a few old news brands or some new brands that have a lot of venture capital money and sort of uncertain futures. I think on the whole, it's that mixed bag. I don't know if I can say one wins or not, but it's sort of doing both at the same time. All right, I'm done. Thank you.